The morning Sarah Connolly turned 22, there were 7 chickens left in the world. She knew this because she counted them every morning the way her father used to count the fields, walking the perimeter of the wire enclosure behind the barn with her hands deep in her coat pockets and her breath making small ghosts in the cold air. 7. She knew their names, which she had given them and which her brother Tom had laughed at, back when Tom still laughed about things like that. Mabel, Frances, Big Red, who had lost most of her feathers to stress, and looked like something you'd find at the bottom of a compost heap, but laid an egg every other day with the tireless mechanical loyalty of something that has decided to survive and is not asking for opinions about it. Penny. Dot. The 2 she called the Margarets, simply because they looked at her with the same expression of faintly offended patience whenever she entered the enclosure, as though she owed them something she had yet to provide. 7 chickens. She counted them the way you count things that matter, not because you might forget the number, but because the act of counting is itself a kind of prayer, a small insistence that these things still exist, that you still exist, that the world has not yet been fully emptied of the things worth protecting. The machines had been in the sky for 3 years and 4 months. She knew that number too. Everyone who was still alive knew it, the way survivors of shipwrecks know how many hours they were in the water. You don't choose to remember it. It just lives in your body like a scar, present in the weight you carry when you walk, and the quality of your sleep, and the specific kind of attention you pay to the sky, that constant peripheral awareness that never fully turns off. The part of you that never forgets what's up there, even when you can't see it. They had come in the middle of October, which Sarah had always thought was a cruel irony, because October was the month everything was supposed to be harvested and gathered in, the month of abundance, the month her mother had called the larder month. Standing at the kitchen window in her green wellies, watching the combine crawl across the south, field like a slow orange beetle. October, the earth heavy with what it had given, the barns full, everything laid in for the cold months. They had come in the way her mother used to say bad news came. Quietly, at first, so quietly you thought you had imagined it. A darkness at the edge of the horizon that wasn't cloud, but moved differently from cloud. A wrongness in the weather. Birds going silent mid-song, millions of them all at once, as though someone had reached down and turned a dial. Then the sound, low and subharmonic, a frequency more felt in the chest than heard in the ears, that went on for 6 days without stopping and drove some people to madness and others to their knees, and which Sarah had endured by fixing things, methodically and without particular plan, just working through every task on the farm that needed doing, because working was the only thing that kept the sound from filling her head. Then the light. She had been standing in the kitchen when the first one came down, a column of pale blue-white that dropped from the western sky like a finger of God, pointing at something it had decided no longer needed to exist. It hit 3 miles away, near what had been the Dalloway farm, a family she knew by sight and by the quality of their vegetables at the summer market. She had felt it in the soles of her feet before she heard it. A concussive thump that rattled the windows and sent every pot on the rack swinging and knocked a painting off the hallway wall, a watercolor of the coast her mother had done on their last holiday. She had stood there, flour on her hands from the bread she'd been making, and watched the sky turn the color of a bruise, and understood in that wordless way the body sometimes understands things before the mind catches up, that nothing was ever going to be the same again. She had stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she had finished making the bread, because it needed finishing, and you couldn't eat flour, and the knowledge that everything had changed did not change the fact that bread still needed making. Her father had survived 11 more days, not the machines. People. That was the thing nobody who hadn't lived through it could quite understand, the thing that made the first year a different kind of horror from everything that came after. The machines killed efficiently and without apparent malice, the way a farmer pulls weeds, selecting by some criterion nobody had ever been able to identify with certainty and acting on it with absolute consistency. But in the spaces between the machines, in the hours when the sky went quiet and the lights went dark, and whatever intelligence directed those silver shapes in the stratosphere seemed to look away, humans did what humans apparently couldn't help doing when the thin crust of civilization cracked open. They went for each other's throats. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Her father had been killed by men with clubs, men who had once been neighbors, men whose names she knew, coming for the generator and the stores of diesel and the chickens. She had hidden with Tom in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, her hand over her brother's mouth, both of them listening to sounds she could not name and did not want to name until the sounds stopped. She had stayed there with Tom for 4 hours after the sound stopped, because her father had told her once, in the first terrible week, that the most dangerous moment was the one that felt like it was over. He had been a precise and practical man, her father, not given to elaboration. He said what needed saying, and then he stopped. And everything he said tended to turn out to have been right, and she had carried his instructions through 3 years like pieces of field equipment you stop noticing the weight of because they've become part of your body. She ran the farm herself after that. That wasn't entirely accurate. She and Tom ran the farm together, except that Tom had lost his sight in the 3rd month when one of the machines had passed directly overhead and done something to the air, some electromagnetic discharge or atmospheric pressure event that the old radio broadcasts had struggled to explain before the radio broadcasts. Stopped, an event that left 17 people in their county blind and 3 more dead of aneurysms before anyone understood what was happening. Tom had held her hand all through the first week of his blindness, which he said wasn't really blindness, more like trying to see through milk. Her hand in his, both of them sitting at the kitchen table, in the particular silence of people who don't have words yet, for the thing that has just happened to them. His hearing was extraordinary now. That was something, and not a nothing. His hands knew everything they touched, developed a vocabulary of texture and weight and temperature that had replaced the visual information he'd lost. He could navigate the farmhouse and the yard and the barn with a confidence that sometimes made Sarah feel her own sight was a liability, all the things it made her see that his other senses simply didn't reach. She had once caught herself envying him his darkness, and had thought about that for several days afterward, and concluded it was not envy so much as exhaustion with the specific visual register of loss, all the things you had to see that confirmed how much had gone. The solar panels had been her father's last good idea. He had put them up in the 2nd week, before anyone understood the alien machine's behavior pattern, just because it seemed like the right thing to do, because a man who had farmed all his life understood that dependence on the grid was a luxury that could always be revoked, and because he was the kind of man who responded to uncertainty by moving towards self-sufficiency rather than away from it. He had climbed up on the roof in the rain in the first week of the occupation, while the machines turned slow circles in the upper atmosphere, and the sound continued, and the sky was wrong in a way that resisted description, and he had bolted down 12 panels in a grid that Sarah had later expanded to 28 when she understood what they were for. The machines, it turned out, did not attack structures running on stored solar power. Nobody knew if this was by design or coincidence. There were theories on the shortwave, what was left of it, ranging from the plausible to the deranged. The one most people believed, though Sarah was never sure belief was the right word for the relationship most survivors had with any information at this point, was that the machines were drawn to thermal signatures associated with combustion, petrol, diesel, gas fires, anything burning with the particular heat and atmospheric chemistry of a combustion event. Solar panels generated no thermal signature in the relevant range. The farm sat invisible beneath its array, a dead leaf on the surface of a pond, and the machine slid overhead without pausing, without registering it, or registering it and deciding it wasn't worth their attention, which amounted to the same thing. This made the panels the most valuable objects within 40 miles, which was a problem. The problem was not abstract or eventual. It was immediate and recurring and required management, the same way weather required management and pests required management, and the slow deterioration of everything mechanical required management. The panels kept them alive. Other people knew the panels kept them alive. Some of those people were in worse situations than she was, and necessity has a tendency to strip away the secondary considerations that normally prevent people from taking things that don't belong to them. She had defended the panels twice before the morning she turned 22. The first time with her father's shotgun and a performance of ferocity she later marveled at in the particular retrospective way of someone who is to sure they could do it again but finds they did it once. She had stood in the yard in the rain with the barrel leveled at men who she could see were hungry and frightened, and in a genuine extremity of need, men who turned away and went back down the track because something in her face or her stillness or the quality of the particular silence she maintained convinced them the cost would be too high. She thought about those men sometimes, in the way you think about unresolved things. She hoped they had found something. She did not hope with any great confidence, but she hoped because the alternative was to stop hoping about people you'd had the power to harm and had chosen not to harm, which led to a place she didn't want to go. The second defense had been uglier, involving a tripwire and a length of agricultural chain and a period of screaming that had lasted long enough to wake Tom, who had come downstairs and stood in the doorway and said nothing, which was the correct thing to say. She was not gentle. She did not think of herself as gentle, and would have been confused by anyone who described her that way. But she was not cruel either, not in the particular way cruelty requires, which is the enjoyment of it, the savor, the desire to see the expression change. She was something else. Economical, maybe. Precise in the same way her mother had been precise about which plants in the garden needed cutting back, and which needed feeding. The same clarity about what was necessary and what was indulgent. The farm was her line. Everything inside the line she would protect with whatever she had. Everything outside it she tried, not always successfully, to refrain from thinking about too much, because thinking about things you could not protect was a luxury you could not afford when what you could protect needed all of you. She had mostly stopped thinking about the machines themselves. You could go mad thinking about the machines. The first weeks she had watched them constantly, straining her eyes at the silver shapes that moved through the upper atmosphere like vast flat fish, through deep water, trying to read intention, trying to understand architecture, trying to find the logic that she was sure must be there somewhere, because nothing this efficient was random. She had read everything on the laptop's downloaded files, the forums, the military communiques that had made it onto the web before the web died, the fragmented testimonies of people who had been closer than she had to the lights when they fell. None of it was useful, not in the way she needed. None of it answered the questions that mattered, which were, when will they stop? What will stop them? And what can we do in the meantime? The meantime was all there was. They took what they wanted from the earth, and they killed what moved, and they maintained some pattern she couldn't decode, and once a day for roughly 60 minutes, they went silent and still. A pause she'd heard, called the quiet hour by enough different people in enough different places over the shortwave that it had apparently become the universal term, the shared vocabulary of the occupation, the quiet hour, when you moved, when you worked, when you did the things that couldn't be done with the machines active overhead. She used that hour for everything that mattered. Water from the stream, feed from the secondary store, checks of the perimeter wire, maintenance on the panels. The only task that made her genuinely afraid, standing on the roof with tools in her hands, while somewhere above the clouds, the machines executed whatever pattern constituted their daily purpose, and she waited for them to stop being quiet. She had learned to work fast on the roof. She had learned to work at the limit of what her hands could do in the limited light and limited time, and to never mind the fear, because minding the fear was a choice, and choosing it was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford for 3 years. She had a routine. Routines kept you sane. This was not a belief she had come to through philosophy, but through observation, through watching the people around her in the first year of the occupation, who had maintained some structure in their days and come through it with something recognizable as themselves intact, and the ones who hadn't and hadn't. She got up at 5:30, regardless of season, because the light mattered, and the machines were less active in the earliest part of morning, some pattern she'd identified over months of watching that she didn't understand, but had learned to rely on the way you rely on weather patterns you don't understand the meteorology of, but know well enough to plan around. She made oat porridge on the wood burner, which was the one combustion source she allowed herself, because the flue ran up through the interior of the house, and the thermal signature was buried by the building mass, close enough to the baseline thermal profile of a large stone farmhouse that whatever the machines were sensing apparently didn't differentiate it. She ate alone. Tom slept until 7, and she was glad of the hour, not because she didn't want Tom around, but because there was a quality to the solitude of early morning that had become necessary to her in a way she couldn't easily explain. The only time she didn't have to be performing anything. No competence, no composure, no the situation is manageable. Just the porridge and the window and the gray-pink sky arriving in the east. She had been sitting with her second mug of weak tea on the morning she turned 22, watching the sky over the east field through the kitchen window, when she heard the sound. It was not a machine sound. She knew machine sounds the way she knew the sound of rain on the corrugated roof, or the particular creak the third stair made, by bone deep. Familiarity, the familiarity that stops existing as knowledge and becomes instinct. This was something else. Footsteps on the gravel track that ran from the main road to the farm gate, the crunch and hesitation of someone trying to move quietly and not quite managing it. More than one person. The way the rhythm broke and changed told her several things. reading it with the same unconscious literacy she'd developed for everything in the immediate geography of the farm. Whoever they were tired. They were not entirely disciplined about their own noise. One of them was possibly injured, based on the asymmetry of the step pattern, and they knew she was here because nobody came down this track by accident. The track went nowhere else. There was nothing at the end of it except the farm and the farm's story and what she'd made of both. She had the shotgun in her hands before she was fully conscious of having stood up. She moved to the window, keeping herself to one side of the frame the way her father had taught her in the second week, when the teaching had felt like paranoia, and now felt like prophecy. There were 3 of them on the track. Men, she thought, though in this light and in the collection of salvaged clothing everyone wore, it was sometimes difficult to be certain about anything. One of them was being supported by the other 2, his weight carried between them in the lurching, stumbling way of someone beyond caring how they looked, or what they communicated about their situation. They were coming fast for people so burdened, coming away from something, she thought. Not toward the farm so much as away from wherever they'd been. The farm an incidental goal, the nearest available cover when cover had become suddenly urgent. Behind them, at the junction where the track met the main road, headlights. She swore under her breath. The vehicle on the road was idling, not approaching, watching. She ran the calculation in the time it took her to breathe twice. 3 people on foot, 1 injured, being watched by an unknown number in a vehicle. The 3 on foot were not running towards shelter because they had chosen this particular farm through careful consideration. They were running towards shelter because it was the nearest cover and they were desperate. And desperation is not selective about its destinations, which meant the people in the vehicle knew they had come here, which meant the vehicle would follow when it chose to. When it was ready, the 3 figures reached the gate. The one in the middle, the injured one, raised his head and looked directly at the farmhouse with an expression she could see even at this distance, and in this light, an expression recognized from her own face in mirrors and in the brief, still surface of the stream. Not fear exactly, but the tightened, hollowed-out look of someone who has made a calculation and found that all the options on offer are bad ones and has chosen the least bad one with the clarity of someone who has stopped having the luxury of waiting for a good option. She thought about not opening the door. She put the thought down carefully, the way you put down something breakable. She stood with it on the floor in front of her for a moment and looked at it. She unbolted the farmhouse door. The man they were supporting was shot. She knew this before she had finished pulling him through the doorway. Knew it from the smell and the particular quality of his weight, the boneless heaviness of someone who is losing the capacity to hold their own shape, the body conserving everything it has left for the essential functions and quietly abandoning the rest. He was perhaps 35, with a gaunt, weathered face and dark eyes that were still tracking, still conscious, still fighting, whatever it is the body fights when it's trying to decide whether to keep going. He had been shot through the left side, below the ribs, and whoever had done it had been using something large caliber and inelegant and had apparently not been close enough to do it properly. The other 2 were a young man and a woman, the young man boy, almost 17 at most, thin as wire, with a rawness about him that suggested recent and significant hunger, and the particular alertness that hunger produces when it's been going on long enough, had the kind of eyes that move constantly and land nowhere, checking exits, checking threat profiles, checking the kitchen with a rapid involuntary inventory of someone who cannot turn it off. The woman was 40-something, gray-haired in an effortful-looking way, as though the gray had arrived ahead of schedule, and she'd noticed, carrying a rucksack that by its shape and weight held more than clothing. She looked at Sarah with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who has had to make fast judgments about strangers for a long time and has gotten accurate at it. "How many in the car?" Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "5," said the woman. Her voice was steady. The particular steadiness of someone who has decided to be steady, regardless of what they're feeling, because steadiness is what the situation requires. "Armed, yes. What do they want?" "What everyone wants," the woman said. Tom had come downstairs, navigating the narrow kitchen doorway with the unhurried confidence that still sometimes unnerved people who encountered him, for the first time, people who expected a blind man to fumble, and found instead someone who moved as though the room had told him where everything was, as though the furniture and the walls had introduced themselves properly, and there had been no ambiguity. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his socks and his oversized green jumper and tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was reading the room by sound and smell and the particular quality of the air. He said nothing. He had a gift for the right kind of silence, for the silence that asked no questions and made no demands and was simply present. And it was, Sarah had long since decided, his most important quality. I'm Sarah, Sarah said. She indicated with the muzzle of the shotgun, a directional gesture rather than a threat. That's my brother Tom. There's water. He needs a flat surface. She nodded at the injured man. The woman set her rucksack on the floor with careful deliberateness, the unhurried movement of someone who wants every action to be legible, to communicate exactly what it communicates and nothing more. She looked at Sarah for a moment, some assessment she seemed to complete without comment. I'm Catherine, she said. He's Marques's. The boy's Eli. The boy, Eli, was looking at the shotgun. He was doing the particular kind of looking that involves calculating something. It stays in my hands, Sarah said. All the time, you're going to be fine with that. Yeah, said Eli, without conviction but without argument either, which was the appropriate response. They got Marcus onto the kitchen table. She cleaned the wound and packed it the way she'd taught herself from the manual her father had downloaded in the first days, the first week when everyone was still downloading things, as though information was the variable that needed addressing. And Marcus said nothing through any of it. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table surface. He was enduring it with the particular focused stillness of someone who has decided that everything the body does is information, and none of it requires commentary. He needs a real doctor, Catherine said from the doorway. There are no real doctors, Sarah said. There's me and what I've learned, which is more than you'd think. Catherine accepted this with a nod that contained neither agreement nor argument, just the acknowledgement of a fact that would have been useful to dispute if it could be disputed and couldn't be. The people in the car, Tom said. He was at the far end of the kitchen, his face angled slightly upward in the posture of listening that Sarah had learned over 3 years to read the way she read weather, the different angles of attention meaning different things. They haven't moved. They're waiting, Sarah said. For what? She looked at Catherine. For morning, Catherine said. They won't come in the dark with the machines active. They'll wait for daylight, for the quiet hour. Sarah stood with her hands at her sides and looked at Marcus on the table and thought about the calculation. 7 chickens, 11 weeks of stored grain, a collection of seeds that might survive another planting season if the spring went the way she needed it to go, which she had no guarantee of, a brother who could not see, a farm held by sheer stubbornness through 2 winters and 3 major incidents, which was what she called them in her own accounting. Major incidents, because calling them attacks would mean something about the nature of what she was doing here that she wasn't ready to formalize. 3 more people in her house, one of them injured, one of them a child in adult's clothing. 5 or 6 armed people at the gate, waiting for daylight. She went to the window. The headlights on the main road were still there, patient, watching. Tell me who they are, she said. It came out in pieces, the way these things always came out now, in the stripped-down functional language of survival. Details offered in the order they mattered, rather than the order they happened. The narrative logic of people who have learned that context is a luxury and sequence is for people who have time. Catherine and Marcus had been part of a larger group, a loose coalition of survivors from 3 neighboring villages who had managed to maintain something resembling organization through the first year of occupation. 30 people at the peak of it. A real thing, Sarah thought, listening. Something with structure and shared resource, and the kind of social contract that required more than 2 people to maintain. The group had a leader, a man named Reese, who had been a security contractor before the invasion and had apparently brought to the task of survival the same qualities he'd brought to his previous career: efficiency, decisiveness, and a very clear idea of who counted and who didn't. In the first year, this had been useful. Reese made decisions. Reese assessed threats. Reese knew things about operational security and resource management and the psychology of desperate people that the others didn't. And in the early months, that knowledge had kept people alive when not having it would have gotten them killed. By the second year, the qualities had compounded in the way that qualities without checks tend to compound. Reese had changed the shape of things considerably. The coalition had become something else, something with less room for the discussion it used to have, less tolerance for the kind of disagreement that healthy groups require to self-correct. A group that took what it needed without the pretense of trade. A group that made certain calculations about necessity that tended to land the same way every time. A group that had people in cars with guns waiting at farm gates in the dark. He sent you here first, Sarah said, to see if we'd let you in. Catherine's silence was its own answer. Then you'd open the gate for them. I didn't say that, Catherine said. You didn't have to. Sarah looked at her. But you didn't either. You came, but you ran. That means something. Marcus said something from the table. They both turned. His voice was weaker than before, the conservation of resources that injured people do, the body routing everything toward what mattered. He said, "She didn't come willingly. Reese has her daughter." The silence in the kitchen had a texture after that. A weight. Sarah looked at Catherine and saw the thing she hadn't allowed herself to look at before, the particular quality of Catherine's stillness, which was not composure but its opposite, something held in place by force of will, a dam rather than a lake, a woman carrying a weight that had no safe place to put itself down. "How old?" Sarah said. "9," said Catherine. Her voice didn't change. That was worse than if it had. Sarah picked up the shotgun and went to the window and looked at the headlights on the road. "Right," she said. She spent the next 2 hours doing what she always did when she needed to think, which was work. She checked the grain store, methodical and unhurried, running her hands along the bags, the way you run your hands along something familiar when you need to know it's still there. She checked the tool room. She went to the barn and counted the chickens again, not because she didn't know the number, but because the act of counting moved something through her that had no other outlet, the same reason people pace or knead dough or stack things. 7. Mabel. Frances. Big Red with her bare patches and her stubborn daily egg. Penny and Dot, who roosted together and were pointedly unfriendly. The Margarets. Tom found her in the barn. He always found her when she needed him to. This had been true before the occupation, and remained true after it, and she had long since stopped trying to explain it, just accepted it as one of the things that were true about her brother, the way certain weather patterns were true about certain seasons. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I don't know yet." "Yes, you do." She sat down on the edge of the grain trough, and he sat beside her, their shoulders touching the way they had sat since childhood, driving in the back of their father's truck, watching the fields go past. "She shouldn't have come here," Sarah said. "No, she put us at risk." "Yes, but she didn't have a choice. Not a real one." "No, she turned the problem over. 5 or 6 people. Armed. They had a vehicle, which meant fuel, which meant resources. They knew the quiet hour, which meant they were experienced, organized, not desperate amateurs. They wanted the farm, not just the food, the panels, the only reliable solar array in the county, possibly further than that. Whoever held the panels held the one thing that made a fixed position survivable against the machines indefinitely, and the machines weren't going anywhere. And that made the panels more valuable than food, more valuable than fuel, more valuable than anything that could be consumed or exhausted or run out. She thought about the shortwave radio, the voice she'd heard once and never found again. A man she'd never learned the name of, who'd said something she'd written on the inside cover of her father's farming almanac. The thing the machines haven't worked out yet is that there's no resource on this planet more durable than bloody-minded human obstinacy. She'd underlined it twice. She hadn't changed her mind. She went back into the house and sat across from Catherine at the kitchen table. Marcus was still on the table, awake now, and watching the ceiling with the quality of attention that suggested he was somewhere else, in some calculation of his own, working something through. "What does Reese actually want?" Sarah said. "Not what he says he wants. What does he actually want?" Catherine considered this for long enough that the question might have gotten lost in the silence. Then she said, "He wants to stop being afraid. I think most of what he does is really about that. Who doesn't?" "Yes, but he's decided the only way to stop being afraid is to control everything around him, every resource, every person, every variable." She looked at her hands. "The problem is that's not actually possible, and he knows it isn't possible, so the project never ends. There's always something else that needs controlling." Sarah nodded slowly. She understood this as a strategy. She had some sympathy for it as a strategy, understood the logic of it even. She thought it was a strategy with a fatal flaw, which was that the universe was not the sort of place that permitted the level of control it required, and that the attempt to achieve it produced in the attempting a series of compromises that accumulated until you could not remember what you had been trying to protect. "Is the girl actually safe?" Sarah said. "For now," Catherine said. "Reese doesn't hurt children. He uses them, which I know is worse." "Yes," Sarah said. She went to the window. The headlights on the road had gone off some time in the last hour. The vehicle was still there. She could see its outline in the growing light, a black shape against the pale hedge. The sky to the east was beginning to arrive, the long, slow British dawn of autumn, color coming back to the world like something being remembered. She had approximately 4 hours until the quiet hour. "There's a plan," she said. Not to Catherine, not to Tom, not to Eli, who had fallen asleep against the wall with his jacket folded under his head, which was both sensible and irritating. She said it the way her father had always said things out loud when he needed to make them real. There's a plan, meaning there will be. What she knew. The quiet hour was 60 minutes of relative safety from the machines. Reese's people would use it to move. They'd come for the gate, then the panels, then the house. They would not negotiate. People who have cars with plate steel welded over the windows have moved past the phase where negotiation is their primary language, what she had. A shotgun, 4 shells, a .22 rifle with a half-empty magazine, 300 meters of perimeter wire, 12 months of intimate experience with this specific piece of ground, a barn, a root cellar, a hawthorn windbreak on the north side, and a solar panel array that, if you knew what you were doing and had the right guidance, could be briefly modified into something considerably more eventful than a renewable energy source. She went to Marcus. "What did you do before?" she said. He focused on her with effort, the specific effort of someone whose body is pulling resources from everything, including attention. "Civil engineer," he said. "Power systems. I spent 8 months trying to understand the machines, their field pattern, the way the EMP output from their descent columns interacts with the electrical properties of different materials." He stopped, breathed, continued with the measured economy of someone who knows how much breath they have. If you have enough stored charge in a solar array, the right configuration, the right grounding, you can induce a discharge event, a pulse. Directional, if you shape the grounding correctly. She looked at him. "It's not a weapon," he said. "Not exactly. But anyone within 20 meters of the primary grounding point, when it discharges, what happens to them?" "They go down hard," he said. "Whether they get up again depends on a few variables I can't guarantee." He looked at her steadily. "I've never tested it. The principle is solid, but the execution has variables." "The gate is 22 meters from the nearest panel mount," she said. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile but had its bone structure. "You'd need someone on the roof to modify the junction wiring. The modification is not complicated. It's about an hour's work for someone who knows the array." "I know the array," she said. "I put it up. During the quiet hour, the machines go passive but not absent. If the discharge looks like a natural overload event to whatever sensor's there, running. Does it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think so," he said. "The signature is consistent with a battery overload during high solar input. They've seen that pattern before and not responded to it." He looked at the ceiling. "I think." She accepted this. The think was honest, which was more valuable than false certainty would have been. "Okay," she said. The next 3 hours were the most purposeful she'd felt since the spring planting. She moved through the farm with the systematic efficiency of someone who has inventoried the same space so many times that the inventory has become instinct, her hands finding what they needed before she fully articulated what she was reaching for. Wire, junction boxes, the long-handled bolt cutters, the spare panel controller from the locked drawer in the outbuilding that she had kept as an emergency reserve, telling herself for months she'd never need it, the way you carry something and tell yourself it's just in case. Catherine helped without being asked. This was the right kind of help. She worked quietly, moved things to where Sarah indicated, held things in place while Sarah connected them, asked questions only when the question was essential. There was a competence to her that Sarah revised upward as the morning wore on. Catherine had spent 3 years inside Reese's operation, not as a victim, but as someone doing the best available thing in a situation that had no good options, and that required a particular kind of intelligence that Sarah recognized and respected. She went on the roof twice. The second time, she could see the vehicle on the road, clearly in the full morning light, a modified Land Rover with plate steel welded over the windows in the improvisational, armored style she'd seen photographs of. 2 people visible on foot at the road end of the track, standing at the field margin, with a particular stillness of people who are waiting for a signal. She worked on the panel mount junction without looking at them. She worked the way she always worked on the roof, which was fast and focused, and without the luxury of stopping to think about what she was doing, because stopping to think was how you lost the quiet hour. When she came down, she told Tom what she'd seen. Tom had made tea. This was so exactly like him that she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and felt the thing in her chest that she never named, just let it move through her and settle. 20 minutes, she said, maybe less, before they move. He handed her the mug. She drank it standing up, looking out the window at the gray-green of the fields. The particular quality of this light at this hour on this morning. She was 22 years old today. She had been 17 when they came, which felt like someone else's life, someone she had read about rather than been. A girl who made bread and went to school and had plans that involved leaving this farm for something, larger and coming back to it later, when she was ready, on her own terms. The farm had been the place she was going to leave. Now it was the place she was going to hold. Tom, she said. Here, he said. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, you know the secondary route. The one along the north ditch through the Dalloway field. I know it. Take Eli. He can guide you to the Pembury crossroads. Someone will be moving there during the quiet hour. You're not going to die on your birthday, Tom said. I'm not planning to. It would be very inconsiderate. I've been counting the days since Tuesday. She almost smiled. Also, I want the eggs first, he said. Francis has been struggling. Tell Francis it's a national emergency. She went out to the barn and stood with the chickens in the early morning, the particular smell of grain and feather and the cold, damp air. 7 animals who had survived everything the world had thrown at them through a combination of luck and the quality of their enclosure and her daily attention, and who had no idea and did not need to have any idea, who simply existed in the narrow, specific fact of themselves. She found this, as she always found it, deeply steadying. She heard the Land Rover start on the main road. She walked back to the house. Marcus was sitting up on the kitchen table. This was more than she'd expected of him, and the effort it cost was visible in the set of his jaw and the tremor in the arm he was bracing with. But his eyes were clear, and he held the monitoring unit she'd left on the table with the ease of someone who knows what he's holding and what it's for. I can watch the discharge readout, he said. You can barely sit up. I can sit up enough to watch a readout, he said. Let me be useful. She understood this. The desire to be useful when you can no longer protect anything through physical means, to contribute something even if what you can contribute is only information. She understood it completely and without condescension. The threshold is 450, she said. When it hits 450, you call out. I'll call out at 420. Gives you 30 seconds. 420, she agreed. Eli was at the north window. Tom was at the kitchen doorway. Catherine had the .22 rifle and was at the back of the house, covering the approach through the east field that Sarah had identified as the route she would have used. The plan was not elegant. Elegant plans required time and resources she didn't have. It had rough edges, and it depended in at least 2 places on luck, which she hated, but luck was in every plan, whether you named it or not, and the ones who pretended otherwise were building on a foundation of false certainty, which was worse. She stood at the front window and watched the Land Rover come down the track. It came slowly, patient. The 2 figures from the road were moving through the east field, using the hedgerow for cover, which was professionally done. She had wired the secondary ground point along the east margin that morning, the second roof visit, and the field approach would catch what the gate approach didn't. They were walking into it, and they didn't know. The Land Rover stopped at the gate. A man got out of the passenger side, late 40s, solid build, moving with a physical confidence that was not bluster but something more fundamental, and therefore more dangerous. The confidence of someone who has tested themselves against difficult things and found that they held up, and who has built a significant part of their identity on that finding. Dark, practical clothing. He stood at the gate with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the farmhouse with an expression of complete equanimity, the equanimity of someone who has already decided how this ends. Rees. He looked like someone who had decided once to stop being afraid and had achieved it, and had not examined carefully enough what the achieving had required of him, and had arrived somewhere he hadn't entirely planned on being. He raised his hand. Not a wave, a summons. She stepped back from the window. She looked at Marcus. Marcus was watching the readout. Building. Full charge from the morning cycle. He looked at her. 400. It's your call. She looked at the gate, and then she saw the girl. She had appeared at the rear door of the Land Rover, stepping out onto the track in the morning light, wearing a yellow anorak so bright against the gray-green landscape that it looked like a misprint, like something from a different photograph inserted into this one. 9 years old. Standing in the gap beside the gate, the way a child stands when an adult has placed them somewhere, and they are not sure whether they are allowed to move. Rees had put the girl at the gate. The world had a texture in that moment, not the rage she'd have expected, something colder. The cold, specific clarity of someone who has just had the last ambiguity in a situation removed. She set the trigger mechanism on the windowsill. She turned to Tom. Change of plan, she said. She went out the back door. She moved around the exterior of the farmhouse at a low run, using the wall as cover, then across to the corner of the barn, then along the barn wall to its far end. 30 meters of open yard to the Hawthorne windbreak. She did all of it in under 40 seconds, not because she was remarkable, but because fear properly channeled is its own fuel, and she had learned that hesitation in the middle of a committed action is more dangerous than the action itself. The Hawthorne windbreak ran along the north field margin and connected at its eastern end to the corner where the track from the road met the gate. She moved along it at a crouch, branches catching at her coat and hair, her hands finding the individual trunks and moving her past them with the automatic knowledge of 12 years of walking this boundary. She came to the corner and stopped, 10 meters from the gate. Reese was 5 meters the other side of it. The girl in the yellow anorak stood between them, her back to Sarah, face toward the farmhouse, one of Reese's people behind her with a hand on her shoulder in the manner of restraint that is primarily communication. Reese had his back to her. She looked at the yellow anorak. A child's yellow anorak, the kind that mothers buy because they're visible, because in an ordinary world visibility is safety, because you can see your child across a field in a yellow anorak. In a world with alien machines that killed by thermal signature and movement, a yellow anorak was a kind of madness. Or it was the most human thing she'd seen in 3 years. A mother somewhere choosing visibility for her daughter before she understood what the new rules were. She stepped out from the Hawthorne. "Hey," she said. Reese turned, his composure held. But she caught the fraction of a second it cost him. The recalibration, the rearrangement, the flash of something that was not fear but was its first cousin. He had not expected this. He had expected the farmhouse, the window, the negotiation conducted across distance, which is the kind of negotiation where both parties can maintain the fiction of control. She had the shotgun leveled not at Reese, but at the person holding the girl's shoulder. She had made this decision in the Hawthorne. Reese was the intelligence of this operation. But the mechanism was the thing that needed changing, and you changed mechanisms by making them too costly to operate. "Let her go," Sarah said. The person at the girl's shoulder was a woman about 30. She looked at Sarah. She looked at Reese. She looked back at Sarah with the eyes of someone conducting a very fast calculation. "She'll let her go," Reese said. His voice was weathered timber, not unkind. That was the thing about him that was most dangerous. He sounded reasonable. "But let's be thoughtful about this." "I am being thoughtful," Sarah said. "I'm being exact. Let the girl go, and then we talk about whatever you came to talk about. We both know what I came for. I know what you came for. You came for the panels. You want a position the machines won't touch. You want safety." She kept the barrel level. "Let the girl go." Something passed across Reese's face that she could not name with certainty. It was not shame. It was the shape that's left when shame has been lived with, long enough to have lost its original form. The woman let go of the girl's shoulder. The girl didn't run. This told Sarah everything she needed to know about the last several months of this child's life, everything that could be said about it in a single piece of behavior. She stood still in her yellow anorak and looked at Sarah with careful eyes. "Come here," Sarah said, the tone she used for the chickens. "Safe, I'm asking, not telling." The girl walked through the gate. She walked with the deliberateness of someone who is afraid and has decided not to show it, a quality so precisely like something Sarah recognized in herself that the recognition was physical. Sarah put herself between the girl and Reese. Above them, the quiet hour ended. She heard it before she understood it, the frequency shift that her body now knew ahead of her mind, the return of the low subharmonic pressure that meant the machines had resumed. The silver shape that had been motionless above the eastern fields all morning shifted, drifted, slow and enormous, toward a position directly above the farm. Everyone at the gate looked up. This was the thing about the machines, even after 3 years. Even when you told yourself you'd made peace with them. When you were exposed in the open and one of them moved overhead, the reflex was universal and involuntary and defeated every decision you'd made about not flinching. Everyone except Sarah. She was watching Reese. She watched the calculation move across his face. She watched him look at the farm, at the panels on the roof, the array she'd spent the morning wiring, and she watched him understand something. Not everything, but enough. "You modified it," he said. "Yes," she said. "You were going to." "Yes," she said, but the girl was at the gate." He looked at her for a long time. Above them, the machine drifted. Enormous, silent. The particular indifference of something so large that individual human beings don't register in its scales. "You'd have killed us," he said. "You came to take what keeps my brother alive," she said. "You came with guns and a child as leverage. I prepared accordingly." "I've kept 30 people alive," he said. "For 3 years. Decisions you haven't had to make." "I'm not interested in the accounting," she said. "I'm interested in right now. Right now, you're at my gate, and your people use are in my east field, and the machine overhead is not responding. Because my array looks like stored solar to its sensors. But if you fire a weapon, or if your people in the east field trip, the ground wire I laid along Hedgerow, this morning the signature changes, and neither of us knows exactly what happens after that. He was still. The machine moved again. Closer. Its shadow touched the top of the farmhouse and moved across it like the shadow of something geological, something that operates on timescales that don't include human plans. Your people come out of the field, Sarah said. They get in the vehicle. You drive back the way you came, and in 2 days you come back with your people, not your weapons, or weapons holstered and no pretense about them. And we talk about what an arrangement could actually look like. An arrangement, he repeated. Yes, the kind where we're both still here in 6 months. The kind that uses what each side has instead of taking it. She looked at him steadily. The kind that might actually work, which is different from every other kind you've been running. He was quiet. Above them, the machine performed its slow, indifferent geometry. She saw it move across his face, not decision, exactly. Something more like the loosening of a held thing. The long exhale of someone who has been maintaining a position that cost more than they'd budgeted for. He raised his hand and made the signal, a rolling gesture toward the east field. She heard movement in the hedgerow, the sound of 2 people emerging from undergrowth, not running, choosing not to run, which was its own kind of communication. She did not lower the shotgun, not all the way. Butt to hip, barrel toward the ground, not surrender. Modification. He didn't reach for his. He kept his hands visible. My name is Daniel, he said. Reese is what people started calling me. I know, she said. Catherine told me. He looked at the farm for a long moment. At the roof and its panels, at the gate, at the girl standing behind Sarah's left hip. His face was doing something complicated and private. The camp on the ridge is failing, he said. The machines have changed their pattern in the last 6 weeks. Whatever they're extracting from that sector, they're accelerating it. We've lost 3 people in a month. I've been watching the drift changes, she said. Your ridge position won't be viable much longer. 3 weeks? Maybe 4. He nodded. So in 2 days, she said. 2 days, he said. He got back in the Land Rover. It reversed up the track with the deliberateness of people choosing not to hurry. She watched until it reached the main road. She watched until it was gone. The machine overhead drifted east. She stood in the yard as the morning settled back into itself. The gray-green of the fields, the pale winter sky clearing at its edges, the particular quality of cold air after tension that makes everything feel very specific and present. She was still holding the shotgun. The girl was still behind her hip, very still, very present. She looked down. The girl looked up, dark eyes, a careful face. The assessing look of a child who has learned to read rooms. Do you like eggs? Sarah said. The girl considered this seriously. Yes, she said. Francis might disappoint you. Big Red won't. She held out her hand. The girl took it. They walked across the yard toward the barn. Tom was in the kitchen doorway, his back to them, which made no difference to his knowledge of their arrival. How many eggs? He said. We're about to find out. Francis? Possibly redeemed. National emergency protocol. He moved aside to let them through, his hand finding the girl's shoulder briefly as she passed, as not holding, just touching, a gentle notation of presence. The girl let him. Sarah set the shotgun in the corner. She washed her hands at the sink, cold water, the soap bar she'd been rationing since September. She stood at the window and looked at the east field where the last of the morning mist was lifting off the grass in slow, deliberate waves. Catherine came downstairs. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her daughter. Her face did the thing faces do when a thing that has been held very tightly is released. Sarah said nothing. She put the kettle on. Marcus was asleep on the kitchen table, a shot man who had decided his body was done asking permission and had simply closed his eyes on a flat surface in a house that had agreed not to fall down. She stood and looked at him for a moment and felt the wordless thing that was not quite hope and not quite peace but occupied their shared geography. She went out to count the chickens one more time. 7, the Margarets, as unhelpful as ever. Penny and Dot roosting together in the corner with the exclusivity of old friends. Francis, on the edge of the group, looking at Sarah with the expression of someone who knows they're being evaluated and objects to the process. Mabel, who came to her immediately, because Mabel had always been the most straightforwardly trusting animal she'd ever met, and perhaps the most sensible. Big Red had laid her egg. Sarah picked it up. It was warm. She stood in the cold barn with the warm egg in her hands and let that be enough for a moment, which is the only way you can let anything be enough, which is by deciding it is. Not pretending the rest doesn't exist. Just deciding that this moment, right now, this specific and irreducible warmth in your hands, is enough for the length of time it takes to carry it back to the house. The machines were still up there. She knew that. Whatever they were doing, wherever this was in their long, incomprehensible project, they were still up there in the high haze, and they would be tomorrow, and she had no idea what they wanted, or when they would stop, or whether the arrangement would hold, or whether Daniel, who had been called Reese, would come back in 2 days as something better than yesterday's version of himself, or just come back as the same thing with different words. She didn't know. That was true. But here was what she knew. She knew the count. She knew every inch of this ground. She knew what the east field sounded like in the morning, and how the south panel's third mount had a tendency to work loose in hard frost, and needed checking weekly. And she knew the weight of Tom's hand on her shoulders and the specific quality of his silence when he was worried, and the different quality of his silence when he wasn't. She knew that Francis was probably going to lay tomorrow. She knew that Eli, the boy from Reese's operation, had the eyes of someone who had been moving very fast for a long time and had just stopped, and that stopping was going to require some from him that needed room to happen and time, and she could provide the room. She knew that Catherine was someone who could be trusted because she had proven it not through declaration but through action, which was the only proof that mattered. She knew that a shot man had stayed conscious long enough to give her the information she needed to defend this place, and that this said something about the kind of person he was that she intended to find out more about when he was healed enough to have the conversation. She knew the egg was warm. She walked back across the yard toward the farmhouse. The pale winter light moved across the fields in long, slow waves the way it always moved at this hour in this season, and the machines were somewhere above it all, enormous and indifferent, doing what they did in the high registers of their own incomprehensible purpose. Below them, on a piece of ground that had been farmed for 400 years and had outlasted everything that had ever happened to it, and would outlast this too, a woman walked back to her house with an egg in her hand and a plan in her head, and the particular quality of tiredness that is not defeat, but the byproduct of effort, the tiredness of someone who has been equal to what was asked of them and knows it. Tom would have the water hot. There was work to do. She did not look up. In the 2 days between Ree's driving away and the agreed return, the farm changed. Not in the ways that could be measured easily. The panel array was still the same 28 units. The barn was still the barn. The chickens were still the chickens. Tom still moved through the house with the confident, precise navigation of someone who had made a different treaty with space than sighted people had. The root cellar still had its 11 weeks of grain, and the seeds she was protecting with the specific care of someone who understood that the future, if there was going to be one worth the name, would need feeding before it could grow. What changed was the interior geography of the place, the quality of occupation. Catherine had slept for 6 hours on the first night, a sleep so deep and sudden that she had gone from sitting upright at the kitchen table to laying across it within the space of 10 minutes, and Sarah had put a blanket over her and left her. And in the morning, Catherine had woken and looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone reconvening with a world they hadn't been sure they'd see again. The girl, whose name was Mira, did not talk much on the first day. She moved through the farmhouse with a careful, watchful quality, staying close to the walls, checking exits, the behavior of someone who had learned that spaces could change without warning. Sarah watched this without comment. She understood it. She had done the same thing herself for weeks after her father died, mapping every room for its exits and its shadows. It was not a thing you could talk someone out of. It faded on its own schedule when the evidence had accumulated sufficiently that the space was safe. On the first morning, Mira had come to the barn with Sarah to collect the eggs. She had stood inside the door in her yellow anorak and watched Sarah move among the chickens with the expression of someone watching a performance they are not sure they understand. Sarah had handed her a grain measure and shown her the scatter from the wrist motion, and Mira had done it twice, and the chickens had come to her with the same undiscriminating confidence they brought to everything that involved food, and something in Mira's face had changed. A very small loosening, not trust, not yet, but the precursor of it, the first relaxation of the held rigid quality that long periods of genuine danger produce in people. Big Red had laid again. Francis had not, but Sarah had stopped counting this as a personal failure. Eli turned out to be more than he looked, which she had suspected but not been certain of. He was 17, he said, though she thought he might be 16, and was choosing not to correct her because 16 felt like something to hide. He had been with Reese's group for 8 months, having been found alone on a roadside, and had been treated, he said with a careful neutrality, as something useful. He had mechanical aptitude. He could fix things. Reese had used him for maintenance, for jury-rigging the kinds of repairs that post-occupation life required constantly. The slow decay of everything built for a world with supply. chains and spare parts. He looked at Sarah's panel array on the second morning, with the expression people wore when they saw something done well that they knew how to assess. "This is good work," he said. "My father started it. The secondary mounts on the east side. Those are newer. Last year," she said, "the junction box on the fourth row has a corrosion issue starting on the terminal posts. You'll want to address that before hard frost." She looked at him for a moment. "I have the material," she said, "if you want to fix it." They worked on it together for 2 hours that afternoon during the quiet hour, both of them on the roof, working fast and without unnecessary conversation, in the way that people who know what they're doing work alongside each other. Communication, reduced to the essential. Past that, hold this, watch the edge. He was precise. He didn't waste motion. He had the economy of someone who had learned to work under pressure early enough that it had become the only way he knew. When they came down off the roof, he said, "They're going to come back with more people than you'll be ready for. Even with the discharge modification." "I know," she said, "but they're going to come back differently." The way he looked at the end. Eli stopped. He had the habit of stopping mid-thought when the thought arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. "Rees was different when he first found me. He was someone you'd follow. I think he's trying to remember how." Sarah considered this. "People can come back from what they've become," she said. "Some of them, under the right conditions." "What are the right conditions?" "Consequences," she said, "and an alternative that costs less than staying the same." On the second morning, Marcus was able to sit up properly and eat. He had theories about the machines. Some of them, the more she listened, seemed less like theories and more like observed facts, waiting for sufficient corroboration. The machines were not simply harvesting. That was the shorthand people used, the word that had become universal, but it wasn't quite accurate. They were doing something more complex. The pattern of their movements, the specific locations of the light columns, the relationship between where they went and what had been there geologically before. Marcus had mapped it obsessively over 8 months, filling notebooks with observations. "They're looking for something specific," Marcus said. He turned his spoon over in his hand, looking at it rather than at her. "Not just resources. They're looking for a particular configuration, something in the geology. I don't know exactly what it is, but the pattern is consistent. The lights don't fall at random. They fall in a pattern that's been moving, slowly, in one direction, north-northwest over the last 3 years." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "The ridge above the Pembury Valley," she said. "That's north-northwest of the first impact sites." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think that's why Reese's camp is failing. I think the machines are concentrating activity in that sector because they've found what they're looking for, or they're close to it, which means they'll clear the ridge. Which means they'll clear the ridge," he confirmed, "and anyone on it." 28 people, she said. She stood up and went to the window. The fields in the flat gray light of a November morning. She had not been more than 12 miles from this farm in 3 years. The world outside her perimeter had become largely theoretical, a territory she knew by the accounts of people passing through it. She had accepted this in the way you accept limitations when the alternative is to be killed by them. "The second array," she said. "If I had enough people and the right materials, how long?" Marcus looked at the ceiling the way he looked at ceilings when he was calculating. "The Dalloway property. The outbuildings. The roof lines are intact. I checked in the spring. 3 days, maybe 4, with enough hands and someone who knows panel systems." He looked at her. "Which you do?" "And Eli," she said. "And Eli," he agreed. "And me when I'm on my feet." She nodded, not at him, at something internal. The closing of a decision. The particular nod that follows the moment when the calculation resolves and the path forward becomes legible. She went out that evening, during the last quiet hour of the day, and walked the perimeter of the farm. She did this every day, had done it every day for 3 years, the same route her father had walked before her and his father before him. The boundary of the thing you were responsible for, marked by walking it. She stood at the eastern margin for a while and looked north, toward the ridge. Somewhere up there were 28 people and whatever remained of what they'd built, and the person Daniel had been deciding to be again. The machines were up in the haze above it all, moving in their patient pattern. She turned around and walked back. Dinner that evening was a collective enterprise. Catherine had found dried mushrooms in her rucksack, enough for a broth that was the nearest thing to luxury the farm had produced in months. Eli had fixed the water pump seal without being asked. Tom had made tea and talked to Mira about sounds, the specific difference between the sound of rain on the corrugated barn roof and rain on the farmhouse slates. The way the east field had a sound in morning wind that was different from the south field because of the hedgerow, the entire texture of the world as it came through his particular instruments. Mira listened with the quality of a child encountering a new way of seeing that opened something rather than closing it. Sarah sat at the head of the table, where her father used to sit, and said very little. Tom glanced in her direction once, and she knew he was reading her whatever he read in her particular stillness, and she met whatever he read with steadiness. She took the farming almanac off the shelf, after everyone had gone to bed, and sat with it at the kitchen table, her finger on the inside cover, on the words she'd written in the second month. She read them, thought about what they had come to mean, how the meaning had deepened rather than changed, the way meaning does when it is tested rather than just held. She put the almanac back on the shelf and slept better than she had in months. Reese came back in 31 hours. He came with 7 people, 2 clearly there in a protective capacity, 2 clearly not. The distinction legible from the way they moved and the things they carried, including a tool roll and rucksacks that by their shapes held medical equipment. He had thought about the meeting. He had prepared for it in a way that communicated effort. He came to the gate and waited. He did not raise his hand in summons. Sarah walked to the gate and opened it. She said, "The machines are moving north-northwest. They've been concentrating over the Pembury Ridge sector for 6 weeks. Your camp has 2 to 3 weeks before the machines clear that area entirely." Reese looked at her. His face went through something. "You're telling me this before we've negotiated anything," he said. "I'm telling you because you need to know it, and withholding it makes arrangements impossible," she said. "Which is not what I want." He was quiet a moment. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus has 8 months of observation data that Reese the administrator had no use for," she said. "Daniel the engineer will find it extremely useful." Something moved across his face she chose to call relief. The relief of someone offered a version of themselves they can recognize without apology. They talked for 4 hours. It was not a smooth conversation. It was the kind that happens between people who have been on opposite sides of a line and are trying to determine whether the line needs to exist in its current form. That kind of conversation requires honesty about what each side has done and why and what it cost, and that honesty is not comfortable and cannot be made comfortable without destroying what makes it useful. Reese talked about the decisions that had seemed necessary at the time, and the way necessity had a tendency to expand its own definition once you accepted it as a primary value. He talked about the point at which the operation had become something different from what he'd intended, and he had kept going anyway because stopping required an honesty he hadn't been ready for. Sarah listened. She did not reassure him. Reassurance was not what this needed, and they both understood that, which was itself a kind of communication. What she offered him instead was the next problem, which was immediate and real and required everything both sides had and more. 28 people on a ridge with 2 to 3 weeks of viable position, a farm in the valley with a solar array, a 12-week food reserve, and the geographic profile the machines apparently ignored. A second property a quarter-mile away with intact roof lines and the capacity for an array 3 times the current one. Fields that hadn't been fully planted in 3 years. She laid it out without rhetoric. Just the facts in the order they mattered. When she finished, he looked at the kitchen, the almanac on the shelf, the patched ceiling, the shotgun in the corner, Tom at the far end of the table with his head tilted. "You'd let 28 people you don't know come here," he said. "I'd let them come to an arrangement," she said. "Which is different. The arrangement has terms. What do you want? Labor, skills, your engineer, your medic, your mechanic. Contribution to food stores from whatever you can bring out of the Ridge camp. And Reese, Daniel, whatever authority you carry has to be surrendered to a structure we both design. Not eliminated, restructured, because 28 people showing up at a farm isn't a farm. It's a different thing. Something that needs different governance." He was quiet for a long time. "I've been the thing that decides," he said, "for 3 years. "I know," she said. "I've been the same thing on a smaller scale. It's not easy to stop." "No," she agreed. "But what you needed to be in year 1 isn't what you need to be in year 4. People who survive long enough have to change with the problem, or they become the problem." He looked at his hands on the table. "My people did things." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for saints. I'm asking for people who will work and abide by the terms and not threaten. My brother. Eli is already on my roof, fixing my panels. Whatever he was to your group, he's something else here. People get to be something else here." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone accepting a weight they've decided they can carry. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she agreed. "Use the first week to move supplies. Last few days, everyone. We'll be ready." He stood and held out his hand. She looked at it, then she shook it. It was the kind of handshake that has history in it and future in it, and the specific weight, of what two people are agreeing to do together with full knowledge of what they've each been separately. Catherine stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing. Her hand found Mira's shoulder. Mira leaned into it. The yellow anorak made its bright, impossible statement against the gray stone wall. Outside, the machines moved in their patient, incomprehensible pattern above all of it. Below them, on a farm in a valley in the gray north of a world that was still occupied and still changed and still requiring everything that could be brought to it every single morning, two people who had nearly killed each other began. It was not a solution. Sarah was not given to declaring solutions. The machines were still there. Winter was coming. 28 people would still have to move. The second array still had to be built. The fields would need planting in spring, and there were 1,000 things that could go wrong. But the future she had found didn't arrive all at once. It arrived one morning at a time, one count at a time. One completed task and the next one begun. It arrived in the warmth of an egg in your hand, and the sound of your brother in the kitchen, and the particular quality of the light at this hour in this season over these fields. It arrived in handshakes and terms and work that started the next morning, which was the only place work ever started. She walked Rees back to the gate. At the gate, he stopped. He looked at the farmhouse, the panels on the roof, the east field in the late afternoon light. The thing you said about people getting to be something else here, he said. Did you mean that? I meant it for everyone, she said, including you. He nodded once. She opened the gate. He walked back to the vehicle. His people followed. The Land Rover went back up the track and turned onto the main road and drove north toward the ridge and the work of bringing what remained of it here. Sarah stood at the open gate in the cold air and looked at the sky. The machines were up in the haze, enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to the human geometry below them, the lines of negotiation and terms, of agreements written in no document because there were no documents anymore, only the things people agreed to in kitchens and held in the body, in the bone, in the daily enactment of showing up. She was 22 years old. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She latched the gate. She went back to count the chickens. 7. She smiled, a real one, the kind that costs nothing because nothing is being performed. She went inside to help Tom with dinner, and the machines moved overhead in their vast and different arcs, and below them in a farmhouse that had held through everything because it was worth holding. The lights were on, and the work continued, and the world, quietly and without announcement, began the long, slow process of being rebuilt.